Hello everyone, my name is Danish Buns, and welcome to this episode of a Noob's Review. This is the gaming show where I bring you relatively unknown games or new releases and try and provide some background information on their actual functionality, as well as my overall opinion. Today I'm going to be talking about Kung Fu Strike: The Warrior's Rise, a new indie 3D fighter game that recently released on Steam and the Xbox 360. This game was developed by Qooc Software, which is possibly one of the greatest names for a gaming company I have ever heard, and takes place in an ancient Chinese realm where a master warrior seeks revenge. Before I get into any of my opinions, I'd first like to talk about what the game mechanics actually involve. The single-player gameplay revolves around the idea of rounds, where after defeating the required number of enemies and bosses, your character will then be rewarded with money as well as health points and unlocks. After taking control of your character, the player must quickly learn to use the WASD keys to move, as well as the multiple key combinations for this 3D fighter, which has you rolling about constantly like you're on fire. Using these blocks and dodge mechanics, as well as your standard ground and air attacks, is not enough, however. To truly master this game, you also have to learn the many combinations of attack and avoidance mechanics, which dramatically increases the game's complexity so that you can no longer competently play fighter games by smashing your head into the keyboard. These combinations gradually unlock over time according to the player's preference, as money earned during each round can be spent to make the more complicated combos available. Players can choose also to spend their money on equipment, which can increase the player's attack strength or give them a health boost in case their health drops below 0. Players can also choose to spend their money on in-game armies, which are small units of players who can hop into the combat and help defeat the hordes of enemies for a small price. These armies can vary and are unlocked by playing and completing the short campaigns throughout the game. This game also hosts a multiplayer mode where you and your best friend can play on the same keyboard and battle through the campaign or match up 1v1 to see who is the best ninja of them all. Alright, now let's get into my personal opinions on this game, and let's first start off with the positives. One of the things that I actually really enjoyed about this game was the challenging enemies. The combat scenes are really enjoyable to play throughout the entirety of this game due to the fact that there is a lot of variance when it comes to the enemy players. The variety of combat styles and the use of different weaponry such as staves and swords requires the players to think ahead of their strategy and master the specific techniques that need to be used against these enemies. This game didn't get any dull with the enemies either, due to the fact that their attacks were always very unique and pretty in a horrifically insulting sort of way. Another thing I really enjoyed about this game was the progression of difficulty throughout the game and the game's attempt to help you as you gradually became better. At lower difficulty levels, the enemy would very visibly change color to yellow or red, indicating whether an attack would be blocked or must be avoided or interrupted. For players less experienced in terms of fighting games, this was an incredibly valuable tool, and it allows for beginner players to learn the attack sequences of their enemies and how to respond to them properly. As the game progresses, the length between the color change and the actual attack of the enemy dramatically shortens, which, though making the game more difficult, allows players to slowly ease into the more difficult combat sequences. This is something that I felt was very beneficial to these sorts of fighting games, because it can become quickly overwhelming to a new player who isn't used to doing anything but smashing their buttons constantly. Another aspect of this game that I really enjoyed was the enjoyable combat mechanics. Though the variety of attacks wasn't innumerous, the visual representation of these attacks, as well as the reaction by the enemy players, was quite enjoyable. Kicking some ninja in the face actually felt genuinely awesome because of the reaction of the enemy in parallel to the actual movement of your character. It was all really fluid. Another aspect that I really enjoyed about the combat was the fact that depending on what keys you press during the activation of your power attack, you would complete a different super attack, which would simply lay waste to any of your enemies. Similar to that of seagulls when they find a parked sports car. Get it? Waste? I know, I'm hilarious. But enough of that, time to get into a couple of things that I actually did not like about the game. And one of the things that I did not like was the absolutely horrendous storyline. This game has one of the worst storylines to a game that I've ever seen. Though I did enjoy the fairly pretty artwork that is displayed in the background, it became immediately apparent that the plot of this game didn't matter to the developers whatsoever. The story, given to the player in small tidbits of text, merely hindered at the rest of the gameplay, as it barely tied in with what was actually going on during these rounds of combat. These small little interjections were meant to give some background to the actual fighting that would occur during the round, but the developers also tried to tie each individual round together, making one of the weirdest congealed masses that I've ever seen. I honestly would have preferred to simply rove from round to round, because for fighting games, the storyline does not matter at all and doesn't need to be incredibly relevant. But you have to make sure that when you're developing a game with a storyline, that it cannot hinder the actual gameplay. Thankfully, these scenes can be skipped, but it still irked me, and it appeared incredibly irrelevant to the game. Another thing that bothered me about this game was the fact that some of the key actions were silly and others simply did not work. For instance, the game decided to chain the action jump and kick keys to the same key. That means you cannot do either of these separately. When you click the key, you will both kick and jump at the same time. This is pretty terrible due to the fact that chaining these skills together removes a layer of complexity that could have been added to the game, giving it more depth. With these skills paired together, the only two buttons that you're going to use during combo attacks are J and K, which is the ground attack and the jumping air attack. That's not that many in terms of the number of attack keys, and I'm not sure that people will have a really great time simply chaining the same two skills over and over and over again. It should be noted, however, that this game was also developed for the Xbox 360, so the reduced ability in terms of attacking may have occurred to allow the Xbox players to play at the same level as the PC players. But I still feel that this needs to be addressed to be more proficient for the PC players. There was another attack where simply holding down the J button, which was your ground attack, would allow your character to repeatedly punch an enemy over and over again, and it would go on for an incredibly long amount of time. All you're doing is holding down the J button. Those short sequences of attacks are definitely enjoyable to execute by simply pressing and holding a single button. Allowing them to occur for an incredibly long period of time shows that the actual combat doesn't have nearly enough complexity in terms of the variance of attacks. All in all, I have to say that this game definitely surprised me. I was not expecting it to be nearly as enjoyable as it was, or even include a multiplayer setup with 2 players that can actually play on the same computer. Though there isn't much to this game in terms of overall attack complexity, the mastery of movement and blocking is definitely key, as well as being able to read your opponent's choreographed attacks. Of course, mashing your keyboard will always be a viable option in terms of playing any fighting game. Anyways, that's it for me. My name is Danish Buns. Guys, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to leave them in the comments section below. You can also send me an email at camosilo@gmail.com. I also have a Twitter page, not as informative as this. I usually just say silly things about cats. That's who I am. So if you are down for that, follow me on Twitter at Danish Buns. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.